In this video, I'll talk about the widest reaching collection of theories explaining how we create and understand visual relationships, the Laws of Gestalt. Even though Gestalt is part of this design principles series, it is much more than a principle. Gestalt is a collection of laws. It explains how we as people perceive and interpret groups of visual elements. These laws are composed of many different visual concepts, some of which you'll recognize from our previous videos. Ultimately, Gestalt gives us a comprehensive approach to visual communication. Now, as you see these words move into screen, please note that each of them has a meaning that we can appreciate independently of the others. But as you put the words together, you create a composition which has the potential to create a much greater impact than just a collection of individual words. No matter how meaningful an individual word or visual element, its primary goal must be to add meaning and impact to the message as a whole. And that's the essence of Gestalt, understanding that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So where did the laws of Gestalt come from? They were originated and developed in the earliest 20th century by three German theorists, Max Wertheimer, Wolfgang Kohler, and Kurt Kafka. Gestalt was developed initially as a psychological concept. Gestalt psychologists are interested in how people perceive the world amongst so much ongoing change. How do people make sense of so much visual stimulation? Now, if they felt that way about the world in the earliest 20th century, imagine how they'd feel today. And that is why the ideas of Gestalt are critical to us as visual communicators. Our job is to reach people with a message, even in the midst of all the visual stimulation which constantly surrounds them. The concepts of Gestalt will help you understand how people perceive, quantify, and act upon lots of information, which in turn will inform your approach to visual communication. And finally, the word Gestalt means essence or shape of an entity's complete form. I just thought I should stick that in here. This video will show you 12 of these laws. There are more, and I encourage you to do some research and learn more about these 12 theories, plus those not covered here. Because the more you understand about how people see the world, the more effectively you will be able to reach them. So, here are 12 of the laws of Gestalt. Let's start with the law of figure-ground. Elements are perceived as either figure or ground. A figure being an object or element of focus, the ground is what the figure sits on. We talked about this when we were talking about positive and negative, so I won't belabor the point again here. Simply, whatever is in front is the figure, and whatever you perceive as being behind is the ground, or the background. Keep in mind that people's perception of figure and ground can be different, so it's your job to direct them to see the relationships as you define them. The next law, the law of area, is closely related to the law of figure and ground. This law states that the smaller of two overlapping shapes is perceived as the figure, and the larger as the ground. So if you look at this arrangement with a large square and a small square, most of you are going to perceive the small square as sitting on top of the big square. However, a few of you may see the small square as being a hole in the big square.
Whatever.
Next is the law of similarity. You'll see as we work through these laws of Gestalt that a lot of them are about how we simplify our understanding of elements by visually combining them into groups. The law of similarity tells us that elements which are similar are perceived to be more related than elements which are dissimilar. So in this example, chances are you're going to see 4 groups of squares and 3 groups of circles. This by virtue of the fact that the squares are very similar to each other, and the same is true for the circles. Our brain automatically turns those into a group which you see first before you start trying to understand the individual elements. That's our brain simplifying our perception to help us make sense of the complicated world around us.
Yes, dear.
Which is good, because I've always found circles and squares confusing. The law of proximity says that elements that are close to one another are perceived to be more related than elements which are further apart. Another way of our brain grouping objects just by simply saying, well, if they're close together, then they must be a group. When you look at this arrangement of elements, chances are that you're going to see three groups: a column of black circles and a column of orange circles on the left, then in the middle, and on the right. But watch what happens as we move the columns around. All of a sudden, the relationships change based on which columns are closer to other columns. Also notice that color has less impact on how we perceive groups than proximity. The law of continuity. Elements arranged on a line or a curve are perceived to be more related than elements not on a line or a curve. So continuity means that people group elements together if those elements follow a common directional path. In this case, you're most likely seeing two groups.
I don't know.
One group that's a vertical column right down the middle, and another group of circles that is on a curvilinear path. The law of common region explains that elements are perceived as a group if they are within the same closed region. In this arrangement, you're most likely seeing 5 groups, 5 evenly spaced columns of circles. But watch what happens when we bring in some shapes to contain those columns. All of a sudden, those 5 groups have become 2 by virtue of the columns being contained within the rectangles. Law of unity. Elements that have a visual connectedness are perceived to be more related than elements with no visual connection. If you look at these 4 circles, it's likely that you're going to combine them into 2 groups, a group of black circles and a group of orange. But watch what happens when we add these linear shapes between the black and the orange circles. All of a sudden, our understanding of the relationship of these elements is different. Now our brain sees 2 different groups, each with a black circle, a black line, and an orange circle. The directional shape between the black and orange circles connects or unifies those elements together. We have a new understanding of how the elements relate to each other. The law of closure states that elements are perceived as a group if they seem to complete an entity. We tend to look for a single recognizable object or pattern, even if there are gaps in the information. Yet again, this is about our brain taking something complicated and converting it to its simplest form. I'm betting that you're seeing 2 triangles and 3 circles here. I know I am. But what's interesting to note is that there are neither circles nor triangles in this arrangement. Our brain is taking what information it has and trying to connect the dots, so to speak. It's turning the shapes into a much simpler collection of objects that is easier to understand. The law of Prognosis. People will perceive ambiguous or complex images as the simplest form possible. So here's our brain at work again, saying, how can I take this complicated collection of shapes and turn them into something that's simple and easy to digest? Prognosis is a German word that, simply translated, means good form. What it means here specifically is that when you look at this image, you are most likely seeing 7 overlapping circles, when in reality, this shape is created from a whole bunch of more complex shapes. Our brain just loves simple. The Law of Symmetry says that when we perceive elements, we tend to see them as symmetrical shapes that form around their center. So, another way we create groups or relationships is by trying to make things symmetrical. When you look at these brackets, chances are you're seeing 3 groups, a left bracket and a right bracket on the left, in the middle, and then on the right. Which is interesting because in this case, symmetry trumps proximity.
That's a problem to me.
So even though these 2 sets of brackets are much closer to each other, most of you are going to be relating to the full set of brackets because they have symmetry formed around a central point. The law of focal point. A point of interest, emphasis, or difference that will capture and hold the viewer's attention. Whether you know it or not, we talked a lot about focal points in our last video on contrast. Focal points are about creating a point of entry into an arrangement. It's the front door of the layout, so to speak. So by forcing the viewer to look at one particular element, they are pulled into the layout and then encouraged to look at the other elements around it. And if you've done your job as a designer, the viewer is going to be looking at these elements in a very particular order, in nice, bite-sized pieces of information, so it's easy for them to digest. And then finally, the law of common fate, which tells us that elements which move in the same direction are perceived as being more related than elements that are stationary or moving in a different direction. This idea will make a lot more sense if you just see it. This law adds the additional elements of time and movement. Most people will see these as two distinct groups of balls connected by their common direction of movement. We've covered a lot of ground in these principles of design videos, and it's probably a little overwhelming as these concepts are most likely new to you. So, do you need to have all these concepts, ideas, rules, platitudes, and laws memorized before you can start creating concepts and layouts? No. But what's nice is that you now have a starting point and a language to use, and you now know that it's your responsibility as a visual communicator to control everything about how the audience receives your message, that you give them the information in prioritized, easy-to-understand pieces. I believe the principles we've covered in these videos will help you to that end. Now get to work. Communicate. All right.